Our next guest, by the way, has written books on rockers from Alice Cooper to Neil Young. He is an award-winning music journalist based out of Detroit. There you go. There's some rock and roll with some amazing stories. He's a regular contributor to Billboard, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Media News Group, Ultimate Classic Rock, Consequence of Sounds, and multiple publications, as well as to radio stations in Detroit and Milwaukee, and even streaming services like this one. Music journalist Gary Graff is the author of 501 Essential Albums of the 80s. We'll get to the one about the 90s in just a couple of weeks, where he and a cast of fellow music journalists presented the most pivotal, impactful, and best albums of each decade across multiple genres: pop, rock, hip-hop, R&B, metal, country, alt, rock, and more. The mega hits that you all know to the... wait a minute, I wasn't aware that that's an essential album. Oh my God, I'm glad I have this book so I can listen to it. Exactly. It's organized by year. There's knowledgeable opinions and reason why each one is there. Some of them incredibly challenging to me to go back and give the album a second listen, as well as label, release date, and other relevant info. But it's not just a list, it's a deep dive, and it's our pleasure to welcome one of the architects of that deep dive, the man with the plan at the center of it all, Gary Graff. Good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
Gary, what an honor. I'm a songwriter in Nashville, and your book, first of all, thank you for being here. This is our first week launching this new radio platform, so it's an honor to have the caliber and the likeness of you here. So thank you and good morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure, believe me.
Okay, so here's the thing, Gary. This is one I consider myself more of a child of the 90s, even though I was alive in the 80s, that music. So I'm excited to have you back in July and deep dive into the follow-up book, so to speak. But here's the deal that's one of the things that's so great about what you do. I hate lists. I hate when we're having a topic and people call in and just list things. I'm like, I need the why behind things. I want the depth and the why. Your book, as Jim said, it's more than a list. It's a deep dive into the albums that shaped the decade, and you really give the why behind their impact. So I want to start here because to me, as we talked about, we've been talking about you all morning, as we talked about with the 80s, to me, I thought initially, I'm like, it's two things. It's either rock fingers or pop head bops. But then we realized this morning, it's really four categories. It's also the synth bands, and then it's also the independent popping into this as well, which shapes the way to the 90s. So how do you, with such a genre blending time, how do you decide what albums really define it when it's not one sound? It's the basis for so many sounds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a lot of coin flips and bribes.
Yeah, I figured. I
really
assumed.
I will tell you too, bouncing off of what you just said, I hate lists too. When we get to the end of the year and it's okay, you got to do your 10 best albums or whatever, I just roll my eyes and go to it. But this is something, the idea of taking a decade, as we did here in the 80s, and of course we did in the 90s as well, taking a decade and really trying to tell its story through the music of that decade was very appealing to me. And the key is that term essential. And, you can say that essential is in the eye of the beholder or ear of the beholder, which is fine as long as we accept that I'm right about it. But it is, the idea is that these are essential albums, and what we mean by essential is they define something. They define a moment. They define a sound, a genre, if you will, and that defining those things helped shape overall what the decade was. And it's not nearly as academic as that, by the way, when we get into making the choices, but that really is what it boils down to.
I'll tell you this, by the way, and one of the fun things about the book is because I really am obsessed with music of a whole bunch of different genres, and the 80s, of course, percolates in my brain because it's when I grew up. I was telling Lindsay the story about arriving in Athens, Georgia, to go to college at the University of Georgia in 87 and the impact that music scene had on my life. But one of the first things when I went into the index, and I would encourage people to do this, if there's an album that you love, go look in the index, is I was so delighted to see Tom Waits' Rain Dogs. I was just like, this is really what this book is about. It's about finding the impactful albums that aren't just in one genre or another, but finding the ones that still continue to percolate and live to this very day, right?
And it is correct, and it is nice to have that benefit of hindsight, 40 odd years of hindsight to do that with and really understand, even something like, let's say, well, Tom Waits' Rain Dog certainly, or we could say like Tracy Chapman's first album, the one with Fast Car on it. You didn't know, and I was covering, it sounds like I'm the relic in this conversation, but I didn't necessarily understand when I was covering that album in real time, that we would still be sitting here talking about it and Fast Car and Luke Combs and Tracy Chapman as a kind of icon. So you really do, this really was an endeavor to understand the context of everything and the history and that why they're still there. Certainly, I was going to say, if you were in college in Athens in the 80s, man, what a place to be.
Oh, my God. We went, by the way, I'll make you laugh, both of you laugh. We went to a little place called the Rockfish Palace one night, and a friend of mine, Jennifer, said, there's this female duo I want you to check out. Well, you know where I'm going with that. And I went, where did these human beings come from? And, of course, it was the Indigo Girls. And I was like, and going down to a coffee shop and seeing 10,000 Maniacs when I was actually visiting the campus for the first time. Just unbelievable. And there are pockets of these scenes that pop up. I'm going to get into a nostalgic ween here, but I wanted to ask you, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Lindsay. I wanted to ask you, were there any when you went and revisited them that really, really, where you could feel the weight hit you of remembering the moment that album came out and the impact that it had on you on a personal level?
There were quite a few. I mean, I just remembering, again, covering in real time, but when Born in the USA came out and when Purple Rain came out, even when Dirty Mind, the Prince's third album, the first one that really had impact, came out, and remembering listening to that and saying, this is something different. Is the world going to get it? And then by the time we got to Purple Rain, okay, yeah, everybody's getting it. But even things like Murmur, the first REM album, Beat Happening, which is a great independent, kind of underground band that really set a template for so much that came after it. For myself, some of the other older contributors, a real trip down memory lane, and then with our younger contributors, there was the old man beating them over the head with, eat your peas and carrots, this is good for you kind of music.
This is good for you. So, Gary, there's, you mentioned the word icon earlier, and there's so many icons that come out of it, but I'm curious your take on, so I watched the BET Awards the other night, and Snoop Dogg in his acceptance speech, speaking of icons, was just saying, icon is about legacy. It's about what you leave behind, how you made people feel, that kind of thing. And so Tiffany, speaking of 80s, Tiffany is oddly a good friend of mine, and we've done some duets together, which is funny for me because I, grew up singing in my hairbrush to her and now sing with her. But I'm, she launched the 80s Mall Tour, of course. I think we're alone now is maybe in 87. But how do you see that kind of place in the teen pop movement? Because Tiffany and Debbie Gibson, they certainly opened the door for the next generation, the Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera's of the world. But how do you, from that kind of icon, how do you, some of these 80s bands that I'll say are still making music today but can't get out of the 80s? How do icons from the 80s, can you ever evolve if you're that attached to the 80s? Or are you always going to be a child of the 80s when you really made your mark in that time? Does that make sense?
It makes total sense, and it really goes back to what I said before about the eye and the ear of the beholder. It's not Duran Duran's problem, and it's not Simple Minds' problem. It's your problem and my problem, and anybody out there who thinks of Duran Duran, Simple Minds only as bands of the 80s and doesn't bother to look and say, you know what, they're still making good music, potent music. They're still there, and they're still making it, and they have evolved as a band. But when I say that's our problem or the audience's problem, I'm forgiving of that too, in that, that's when we found them, that's when we loved them, that's when their biggest hits were, and that's what the audience is most interested in.
Yeah,
not everybody. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, because that goes back to the feeling, I guess. It's like it's our problem, but it's also a total compliment because I can hear some of those songs. I know where I was, my first kiss, the waterbed I was laying on. That sounds creepy, and it was, guys. But anyway, like it's the soundtrack of our lives. So it's equal parts to the artist, I guess, a blessing and a curse, perhaps, and just eyes and it's all about perspective, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, any artist who's blessed to have, a career of some length, and this includes the Rolling Stones and Paul McCartney and Billy Joel and, even the individual components of Led Zeppelin. If you've been lucky enough to have that length, you are always going to be held up to the work that made you, I guess, the most famous or the most popular, that made you iconic. The Rolling Stones will never live down XL on Main Street, nor would they want to necessarily. But it does create a challenge when you want to bring out, let's say, a Hackney Diamonds, and have it held and received by an audience with some degree of attention. Or Duran Duran, when they put out their next album, it's not going to be Rio, So it's a conundrum for them. I think a lot of them are laughing all the way to the bank about it.
Exactly.
They're still playing the full venues, and they're still being written about. There's still a lot of attention being paid. Look, just this past week, the Doobie Brothers put out a new album. Now nobody's going to think of that in terms of Toulouse Street or The Captain and Me, or even Minute by Minute. But there they are on CBS Sunday Morning. So once you're in the lane, you're always going to get a degree of attention paid to you, even if your brand new music is not embraced the way your classic music was.
If they're not talking about you, Jim, they're not talking about you.
Yeah, there is that.
The other interesting thing too is about what's not there, and I'm not calling into question what's not there that you couldn't list.
You can do it. You can do it.
I'm not doing that though, but you're going to actually like this. I'll give you a great example. A few people chimed in on our chat this morning because we had a whole bunch of people. We've been talking about this all morning on the show, even during the trucking segments. And some people were like, oh, Bat Out of Hell. And some people were like, Joe Jackson's first release. And somebody said The Wall. And I'm like, no. It's like that stuff is late 70s. And so what a lot of people don't understand is like an album like The Wall, which is released in November of 1979. As a kid, I remember in the 80s, the early 80s, listening to, Another Brick in the Wall over and over again. It got played everywhere. But it's helping people understand we're talking about the ignition switch of the song. There are songs, because of classic rock and all of that dominate the 80s. I mean, Steve Miller gets a second life because of College Kids in the 80s. But he's not releasing those albums then. And that's a really kind of important distinction point about what the project is here. You're talking about the album, kids getting in line at the Metronome in New Orleans, or Apple Records, or any of the Peaches Records, all of those places, people getting in line to buy records that are pressed in this decade, right?
Correct. Yeah, we went by release date. Another one a lot of people ask about is London Calling by The Clash. That was another late 1979 release, but guess what, kids? It's late 1979. So we are tied to that release date, not when it had the greatest impact. And when you get to some of these records from 1989, Quincy Jones Back on the Block is the one that comes to mind most immediately, or the first Indigo Girls album, since you mentioned them earlier. Don Henley, The End of the Innocents. People think about those as 90s albums, but were actually released in 1989. So yeah, we stuck to release date.
Like I said, it makes for really interesting reading because of that. Because a friend of mine once told me that the '60s are actually 1967 to 1974, and the idea of what that experience feels like. But this is where the '80s really get started.
Hopefully by the time you get into the chapters, the 1988 chapters, the 1989 chapters, and you're listening to, let's say, Ultramagnetic MCs or the Sugar Cubes or De La Soul or Inner City, Beat Happening, you're starting to see 9 Inch Nails was 1989. You're starting to feel the 90s.
Yeah,
there.
And
you're starting to feel what's coming. And similarly, if you look at the 1980 albums, you're still feeling the 70s a little bit, with not only artists like the first album in the book is AC/DC Back in Black. And, classic, very classic rock band, that could have been an album of the 70s, just happened to be released in the 80s. And Pat Benatar and Black Sabbath, you have a number of bands releasing albums then that could just as easily have been released in 1977, 78.
That's the interesting piece for me, the ones that are setting the scene, because it makes, like, Janet Jackson's Control to me is everything, because it's a reminder that she was making statements before Rhythm Nation, which is, we think Rhythm Nation when we hop into it, but it's those things where it's what was setting the scene, it's what was building to the next thing, which is really cool. So we're talking with Gary Graff. His book Essential. I want to say that again. Essential. The Essential 80s Today, the Essential Albums. And we'll have him back for the 501 Essential Albums of the 90s next month in July. Gary, two good friends of mine that live in LA, they recently, a couple of years ago, bought one of Rick James's houses in LA. So you can imagine you can imagine the energy that place holds. It's the one where MC Hammer had some very dark days. So it's a
hell of a house.
It's a hell of a house. They did a lot of staging when they just removed the center downspout in the master bathroom, if you know what I mean. So you go. But it makes me think. Speaking of Rick James, then, and his impact on the '80s, and how street songs and his work with Tina Marie. Yeah, how his work with Tina Marie blended that funk, rock, and punk energy into something totally unique. So talk a little bit, if you will, about his impact, or others of his likely, that it's like, because I'm sort of obsessed with, as an artist and a songwriter myself, this is a new obsession, getting out of the word genre and being like, let's get in the studio, let's get multiple people in here that come from different walks of life, throw some stuff down and see what happens. And that's kind of what was happening with the Rick Jameses of the world, agree to disagree, where it's like, take that word genre, that label out of it, and let's see what happens. Do you feel that?
Sure. I mean, you had Rick James and Prince, obviously, and they were working contemporaneously, not always harmoniously, side by side, but they were, they came, and it's interesting because here you have a Rick James who comes from Toronto, and you have Prince who comes from Minneapolis. These surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, but these cosmopolitan music scenes where there wasn't an issue about artists of different genres or different styles getting together and making music together. One of the great sidebars in Rick James' story is his first recordings for Motown were in a band called the Blackbirds, whose members included Neil Young. So he was already doing this in the 60s. And, the same thing with Prince. Prince had as much rock and punk to him as he did funk and R&B. So though, Talking Heads, was a band that early on were weaving together, aspects of world music and funk along with punk rock. And I think that's just evolution of music. And, we can look back into the 60s and 70s and find that in popular music too, but it certainly became more prevalent during the 80s. And, music itself was becoming more international. You could buy a Beatles album in the streets of Jakarta or wherever. Mm-hmm. So, but then the musicians there were incorporating some of the pop sounds and rock sounds they were hearing from the industrial West with their own indigenous kind of music and making something brand new. So the 80s really were just the next step in that. And the fact that we had so much media that was exposing music around the world. I mean, we always talk about MTV as a game changer, and I don't think it's always understood how much of a game changer it was just in making us all think about music as music. We still had our tribes. We still had our headbangers, our rock fans, our pop bands, our funk fans, R&B, whatever. But if you're watching MTV for a half hour, you were pretty likely to see a pretty wide breadth of music, and that made us all, for a minute, music fans. You know, not just music, but just music fans. You know, we were happy to hear music, and we were open to all sorts of different styles and genres. And that was really a magic and unprecedented moment in culture.
I'm going to ask another killer question in regards to putting you in an agonizing situation. Was there anything that didn't end up in the 501 that just killed you on a personal level?
Our pat answer to that is no, these are the 500 ones.
You can tell us off air.
We're planting our flag. We're dying on the hill. Were there some tough choices? Absolutely. You go into something like this and you think, 501, that's a big number. How are we going to find that many? Then you make a spreadsheet of 2,400. And that you have to choose from that are all candidates, and it's like, so it was these 501 are the product of what I'll euphemistically call discussion among myself and the contributors, the publisher, other music friends, and winnowing it down, and as I said at the beginning, applying that term essential. And it really became, if this album's not in the book, do I feel like there's a hole there? And if the answer is yes, obviously it's in there. If the answer is not really, love the album, but not really, then no, it doesn't. It doesn't go in there. So there are for all of us. There were personal favorites. Myself, we talked about Athens, Georgia early on. It was hard not to put every REM album from the '80s in the book. You just can't. You don't have the space. So we had to choose those judiciously. Same with Talking Heads. Same with Prince.
Yeah.
We were lucky. Bruce Springsteen only put out 4 albums in the '80s, so it was kind of easy to get those in. But Hall and Oates, all their big albums. There were a lot of, like I say, euphemistically, discussions about what should and shouldn't be in the book.
Well, I kept thinking about that, too, because I was telling Lindsay before you came on that Life's Rich Pageant is one of my favorite albums of all time, and there it not is. But that being said, I'm not cutting Document or Fables of the Reconstruction. I'm not making that call. That's not a call I want to make. That's
funny. I was going to say, it's funny. Life's Rich Pageant is one I get called on quite a bit, when I'm talking to people about the book. And just to give you a sense of the thought process, when you looked at the, development of the band and the impact of particular albums, great album. All the REM albums were great. But Life's Rich Pageant felt like a little bit of a holding pattern, whereas then they moved on and started to get, Life's Rich Pageant felt like it was retrenching some of the things they'd done up to them and maybe refining them a little bit.
Yeah.
Gary,
go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I just say, let's talk. Do you ever get in fights? I just have this vision of you in a restaurant and somebody walking by be like, why didn't you put this in? And then you being like, you write the book, you take the challenge, dude. Like, it's not easy. And everybody, it comes down to, you're an expert in this, so it comes down to the basics and really diving in. But then there's a little bit that it comes down at some point. It's perspective. But I just wanted, if anybody ever critiques, I want to be like, dude, you try to do the task. It's not easy. Okay, Gary, let's talk about you, because do you remember the first cassette you bought in the 80s? And like, what is Gary in the 80s? Who and where is Gary in the 80s that bridges the gap to you writing this book today? What is the feeling, the song, the album? If you look back and be like, that's maybe how I got into this career.
Well, I had hair back then. So
you and me, brother. You and me.
Yeah, there you go. I kind of missed that. So what was special for me about the '80s is I graduated college in '82, and went took my first job, which was writing about music here in Detroit. So I kind of walked into the revolution. What everything that was going on in music and being able to write about it. And cover it on a high daily Metro newspaper, kind of way, and a lot of access to the artist, to the business, to everything that was developing. And it was interesting for me going from being a little bit of a snotty-nosed punk rock college kid, to coming to understand the nuances, not just of the music industry, but of a listener, of a fan, of a day-to-day music fan who was more casual than I was about it. So, if I'm walking around, the Clash or REM do or die, I had to come to understand why Quiet Riot was as successful as they were.
And then so the second one I got to ask real quick, Jimmy back. I want to know from Gary, if you had to be stuck on a tour bus with one 80s band, who would it be?
Boy, there are enough of them that I was stuck, and
Right,
I don't remember, which means it was a great time. It had to have been a great time. I mean, just I think the REM ride would have been fun to take on their tour bus because the arc of their ascent and their creative development over the course of the 80s would have been something to be a fly on the wall. To watch that creativity, to watch that audience build, I think really would have been special.
Do you want to hear a really great story about REM really quickly, having been at
Absolutely.
the University of Georgia? I was actually an art major there when I first got there, and Jim Herbert, who was the head of painting, was also their director of all their first videos. They walked into the art department as a group with Herbert waiting in the lobby with an 8mm camera in his hand to go out in the back and shoot one of the videos that they would eventually release on MTV.
That's great.
I mean, and that kind of stuff was happening down there. The number of bands, the number of buskers, the number of people, they would just show up under the name of Wheel of Cheese at the 40 Watt Club and play secret concerts there. That was the energy around all of that. So I think you're right. There was something really groovy going on there. Really cool.
That definitely with that band. And keep in mind, we're talking a lot here about, the rock and pop and the R&B movements, but the book includes, and there were major developments during the 80s in country music and in gospel, and certainly the electronic music coming along, techno, which was born here in the Detroit area. There were a lot of doors opened that new, not just new artists but new forms of music, came through, and that was also fascinating in the 80s.
Gary, can you believe we're out of time? Please.
No, say it ain't so.
Isn't it great? You get music geeks together, and it's like watching MTV in the 80s. Oh, I'm going to watch this for a half hour. 9 hours later, you're turning the TV off.
I want to be stuck on a tour bus with Gary.
Yeah, come on, man. We got to get the band together, dude. By the way, I saw Duran Duran recently last year over at Red Rocks. Still got it, man. Gary, where can we go check you out? Where you got information from? You have anything going on that people can take a look at?
There's always stuff going on. Graff on Music on Twitter or X. Gary Graff on Music on Facebook, Real Graff on Music on Instagram. Those are the best places where I usually post most everything.
It's the Graff.
And most importantly, 501 essential albums of the 80s. That's the key right there. We're going to post all of that stuff on all of our socials as well. Gary, please come back. Oh wait, you are coming back to talk about the 90s in just a little bit. Thank you so much, my friend.
All right, you guys have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
#RGR.